non-traditional performance slash critical Fs. Some of you might be thinking about doing this, but what I will say for this topic this year, it is very much so important that you actually read the literature that a lot of this stuff is coming from, because it's very highly technical and has a lot of jargon to it and a lot of theoretical basis of like why the particular scholars are saying the things that they're saying about the environment. And it's very rooted in a very historical understanding of how the environment has been abused and mistreated and extracted from overly. Okay. So the thing about performance debate in itself, just pretty much any debate style and content which differs from traditional policy debate and cost benefit analysis using things like United States federal government, a plan, stock issues, things of that nature. And the debate is usually revolving around certain political consequences and actions or inactions of debaters in the room. And so the major question that you need to ask yourself when you're doing this particular style of debate is like, what is your particular relationship to the resolution? Like, what is it about the protection of water resources or things of that nature, or just water in itself, that makes it so important that we examine the resolution in that way, or to not have a very traditional, very calcified understanding of it, okay? So some of the elements that I would talk about is the embodied critical arguments, personal identity slash narratives, performances slash stylistic choices, okay? So thinking of those three subsections of like performance debate or just critical acts in itself, first thing is political consequences. Pretty much a broad term, talk about the discursive, physical, and symbolic political meanings of the way that you engage debate or the way that you represent your arguments. This can be a positive or negative thing. It's more so how you choose to define the debate space in itself, or how you define politics in a debate. Because usually when you're reading arguments like this, people are going to say that you see the political, or you don't address the political nature of what's going on, or the policies that are based in water, right? And so what people need to be thinking about is, how do you engage politics, and how can we define political stances in ways that are not just about voting, making policies, and passing laws in certain ways. It should be more encompassing about how you live your life, how you politically engage, like your everyday lived experiences, stuff along those lines. Politics is not just what happens on the floors of Congress and any of the other legislative or legal bodies. It's also how we communicate, how we think about the world, right? And so you cannot have a traditional team tell you that politics is only one way, because that is a very calcified, very stagnant way to think about politics, because it doesn't account for people who are not included in the political structure in itself. The next thing is actions and inactions. It's concerned with not only what happens in the debate or what is said in debate, but the totality of what is done in the debate round in itself. Other times what has been failed to be done, and what critical importance it is to the outcome of the debate, because sometimes people will say and do stuff that you might want to make into what is known as a shutdown debate, where like you will only talk about that one thing that they have done and why it has caused this not to be an educational round, or why it has not caused this round to be perceptually safe or inclusive of certain bodies that were excluded by what they said or what they've done or what they performed. And so if you're going to do that, you want to have a very strategic lens of how you're going to look at and speak about this bad thing that they've done, and how you're going to talk about it for the rest of the round. Sometimes people will see, like, when folks misgender someone will say, like, that misgendering language is something that we're going to talk about as the bad thing throughout this entire debate that is left off, because I told you my pronouns and you did not respect them. And now we're going to talk about how your gendered language is something that links to a larger system of, gender inequality or gender exclusion or sexism. And we need to discuss that. Okay. And so that's usually how you would oftentimes punish a team for not being, understanding of certain people's way of life, or if someone talks about something ableist, or if they do something that is perceptually racist, right? You should not just make that a singular argument in a debate. You should interwove it throughout all the rest of the speeches so that it is not just like a footnoted type thing. Last thing, debaters in the room. All debaters, keep in mind, are performing, but it is what these performances in the round mean and how they implicate them, or even you sometimes, in a larger system of oppression or dominance, or a lack of knowledge of how they've added to it, and what consequences come from ignoring those particular actions. So a lot of times when people will say, oh, you did this bad thing, and they never really go into how does that create a bigger impact on larger society as well as the debate space that we're in, because that is definitely a thing that is necessary. Oh, sorry. Oh, yeah, sure. So make sure that when you're examining and looking at rounds, that you look at every opportunity to talk about how it has political consequences, social consequences, economic, maybe even educational consequences, because a lot of people don't do that, and it makes it seem like really like not authentic. Okay. So what is performance debate as this term? Performance debate is steeped in what is known as performance theory, which Jason Jarvis was talking about earlier today when he said that you could be a performance studies major. It is a subsection of communication in most places. Some places it's not. But usually this particular discipline is about unraveling subjugated knowledges and how the body performs itself in certain environments, and explaining the world in terms of the everyday lived experiences of folks that are performing their bodies in certain ways, and how do we effectuate change to dominate ideologies like racism, sexism, homophobia, transphobia, all those different isms that exist. But more popularly, people consider a performance team as one that is deploying stylistic or arbitrary choices that are not with the same presentation styles as like traditional teams, right? And so in a lot of ways, these teams should be performing their politics, or how they think a debate space should look and how it should operate based on the things that they're doing in the round. And so you usually will have those teams claim advantages off of the speech acts rather than like, a fiated imaginary plan that allegedly happens, post around. But even goes beyond reading a critique in the round itself, because performance debate is also embodying that critique in some way, not just reading a bunch of cards and saying, oh, that was my performance. And that's what people, they kind of mess up on, and not understanding that yes, everything is a performance and debate, but particularly when we're performing our politics or performing our bodies or putting our bodies on the line, is that we're doing it in lens of the particular theory of power that we're talking about. And I'll get to what that theory of power means in a second. But yeah, so that would be performance, and how you would like do certain things like, poetry. Certain teams have rapped in the past, certain people have acted out skits, certain people have used certain instruments or tools in order to enact their things, candle burning, sage, all these different things that could link to your performance is a thing. So critical apps, right? So critical apps in themselves are ones that are not always necessarily a performance. They could possibly have performative elements in it, but a critical app in itself could still have components of like the stock issues or advantages, but you don't necessarily have to perform your politics in this way. And this is kind of like you reading cards about certain theories of power in relationship to the topic. For example, some people have started this field called critical water studies. And so someone could probably read an app that is steeped in critical water studies, that is criticizing the way that policies don't always look to the folks that are most affected by water crises and issues, right? Or having more of a first world understanding of those water problems. Because, there's not a lot of places. I mean, there are places that exist outside the United States that don't always have access to clean, running, fresh, drinkable water. And so us in the United States, we get this really privileged understanding that we should have water that is clean and should be filtered and things of that nature. But we don't understand, and we take that for granted sometimes. And then that's why it seems to be so weird and so out of pocket when we see things like Flint, Michigan that happen, because it's like, this is America. What do you mean? Why can't people drink water? Or if we think about places like the Central Valley of California, where there's a lot of water crisis issues going on, like particularly in a place called Porterville, where when I lived in Fresno, there was a point in time where they had to get tankers of water shipped in because they could not turn on their water and drink from it. And this is like during that time of the drought. But it's those types of everyday lived experiences that we have to think about when we talk about water, because we don't always have to experience them, right? And so with these critical apps, you should definitely have some advocacy, or if you choose not to, that could be a thing as well. But if not, you need to have some type of role of the ballot, role of the judge, or framework to defend the arguments which you're trying to center as very important. And so that theory of power is pretty much how you tend to look at power in the round. Is it oriented around anti-Blackness, neoliberalism, patriarchy, heteronormativity, capitalism, all these particular isms that have constructed certain forms of oppression that exist today, right? And of course, neoliberalism is seen as a subsection of or a late stage of capitalism, where a lot of companies have commodified certain identities and certain cultural practices and to include them inside of their corporate scheme of spreading more capitalism. So for example, do y'all recall, like, last month was Pride Month, right? And so you saw like all these companies had all their type of like pride stuff that they were doing, or they had their pride products, right? And so all those companies are making a profit off of the identity of LGBTQIA folks without really having to do the work to actually dismantle the systems of heteronormativity and transphobia that have created the necessity for pride to occur. Do y'all understand what I mean by that? Like how that is a very neoliberal approach? Yes, no? Is there anybody talking in the chat? No, we good? We understand that concept of how neoliberalism can commodify certain identities and sell them as products, marketable, make that oppression not look so oppressive anymore. Or if y'all think about 2020, the Black Lives Matter protests and things of that nature, some of you might have taken part in that, right? We started to see all these businesses start doing all their like little small things to like help Black people. Like Amazon created like the little Black business button where you can like shop for Black stuff, and Uber Eats made a like a Black business, a Black restaurant and services thing, right? In order to like still see themselves as a part of this like struggle, but not really, and not seeing their role in it. Okay. And so oh no, we don't need that part. So another thing when we think about embodied critical arguments, teams usually will have a political stance on the topic and perform what that might look like, right? Poetry, rapping, cultural narratives, personal narratives. These are all examples of what some people have done in debate in order to embody a lot of their politics or embody the criticism that they're making. Poetry has seemed to be one of the bigger ones that have existed, like especially last year and years before that. And so using that language as a way to talk about the importance and the everyday lived experiences of people is a tool that folks like Audre Lorde have said that it's not a luxury, that it is something that we can't take for granted, and that when we use poetry, it comes with a social responsibility to express the aggrieved nature of how people are living their lives in light of the social issues that we're talking about. And of course, using things like rap and hip hop culture as a way to express some of the aggrieved communities as well, because a lot of people will see, rap artists or singers or people that are talking about the everyday lived experiences of folks as a form of organic intellectualism. Like these are the people that have experienced some things that they put into the music to express the politics on the streets, right? And so that could be a thing. Cultural and social narratives are accounts that are either based in fiction or nonfiction or a particular story of a group of people, right? And so when we think about water, like there's a lot of cultural narratives that exist steeping from things like, immigration, transatlantic slavery, just people not having access to fresh, clean water in other places around the world. There's a lot of narratives that are steeped in that. Personal narratives as well about water. Like you might debate against people this year that, don't always have consistent access to clean water in some places, right? And, there are places like that exist in America. And some people will even express some of their disdain for the ways that these things happen. So that could be a thing that occurs. So watch out for and think about those embodied arguments that could happen. So now I'm gonna get into some of the different critical arguments that will exist on the topic. So one of the major ones that I think that some people might utilize is the various eco-gender type arguments. And so the major top two ones that exist are ecofeminism and eco-womanism. So ecofeminism in itself it's just like an academic movement, and some advocacy was, steeped in it like during the late 80s, early 90s. And so it was to try to bring together a lot of the green movements that were like environmentally based and feminist ideologies into it, to, offer a challenge to the way that, feminism has not always included a critique of the environment, and like the green movements have not always included a critique of patriarchy. And so ecofeminism itself is trying to connect how those things exist and how that the dualism of reason versus nature is always something that has pushed for the over exploitation and over extraction and utilization of the environment, and especially its resources, particularly water, oil, coal, things of that nature. And so we have to think about how those very gender understandings of natural resources are the same ways that are used to exploit and oppress women. Okay, and that's like what ecofeminism and those arguments kind of erupt from. And so, however, there's a little bit of problem with ecofeminism that it didn't necessarily speak to a lot of the experiences of women of color, or particularly Black women. So in response to that, but also just like an affirmation of African cosmology or African-centered understandings of the environment, there was created eco-womanism, okay? And what the particular authors define eco-womanism as the discourse, a dialogue, a conversation that centers the voices and sociological and experiences and perspectives of women of African descent and other women of color on the environment. It is interdisciplinary, as in it attaches itself to all types of academic disciplines, like English, philosophy, political science, things of that nature. And it links it to an intersectional, it links it to intersectional social issues with issues of ecological justice. So ecofeminism attempted to do this in a sense by saying that women and nature have these particular connections, but eco-womanism is saying not just women, but also like all folks that are in the communities that are oppressed have this connection to the environment. And we have to think about that logic of domination that was used to enslave Black women and to create transatlantic slavery is the same logic that is used to make eco-violence and the control over natural resources in a very over-extracted way. And so that connection is something that eco-womanism is trying to go further and to talk about the experiences of people of color, because even in ecofeminism, it can come down to like this perception of environmentalists caring more about animals and white women as opposed to the experiences of people of color, and particularly Black women. And so a lot of emphasis in eco-womanism is placed on the intersection of human, the natural, and the spiritual realms. Eco-womanism is more theologically centered as opposed to ecofeminism. Ecofeminism is more secular in its approaches. Eco-womanism is really about connecting itself to the spiritual realm and talking about how people of color are in tune with nature in ways that we try to separate ourselves from because we have been divorced from nature because of this reason versus nature dualism that says that because we're humans and we have, the capacity to reason and use logic, therefore we should be able to extract and utilize the environment in nature because it is something that is an entity that is a tool for us, a very instrumental way of viewing nature. And so you will see, I feel like both of these criticisms that exist on the topic. And I feel that they're I don't want to say they're very adversarial in a way that they are approached, but in a debate round, I feel like if someone reads ecofeminism, eco-womanism can be an argument that is used to answer it in some way. If someone has an eco-feminist ask, could be a thing. But on the side here, I have some of the people that have definitely been a part of these particular movements. Greta Gard is one of the eco-feminists that exist, one of the popular ones. But also Vandana Shiva is a third, it's post-colonial feminism, but it's still steeped in ecofeminism and her particular strand of it. She's one of the major scholars. She talks about development and things of that nature, and how development practices have been ones that have destroyed a lot of the third and fourth world that exist. And on the bottom, we have Melanie Harris, who is one of the primary scholars of eco-womanism. And there are some books that kind of go along with these things. Oh, sorry. Any questions on these two concepts here? Eco-womanism, ecofeminism? Because if not, I'll have time. So online, Melanie Harris has a lot of lectures where she's talking about this concept of eco-womanism. Greta Gard has some as well, and other people like Val Plumwood is another scholar in eco-feminism that exists. And so if you just type in YouTube eco-feminism or eco-womanism, a lot of their lectures will come up because they're very good lectures, I would say. And these concepts very much so are trying to work through the connections of how nature becomes very feminized and over instrumentalized, because that's how people were trained to look at the environment. Okay, so look that up, it's very good. But also be reading the literature because these are some very heavy concepts, and I'm pretty sure some of your counterparts will be reading them. So the next one is environmental managerialism. So originally these were some Heidegger arguments, but a lot of other people have taken these arguments into different directions that are not highly philosophical in ways. There's a guy named Tim Luke who does a lot of work on environmental managerialism as well and takes it into a very more pragmatic approach, but still in a critical way to criticize the way that people who have been trained to become experts on the environment learn how to become that as very professional technical workers, and it doesn't really take into mind solutions that are good for the environment, but they're more so scientific and technical solutions that are for gaining profit. Because at the root of a lot of the environmental managerialism criticisms today is a critique of capitalism and how capitalism tries to save the environment in the same token that they've destroyed, right? Or capitalists have destroyed, or using, very much so neoliberal ways to roll back environmental regulations. A lot of the stuff that Trump was doing right? And so those people that are the professional technical workers have adopted this very environmental management approach that is divorced from caring for the environment, but more so caring for the profit and like how that works as goods and services and not in terms of how that particular natural resource should be preserved for preserving sake, right? Because it's more so now about extracting those resources to make it useful for people. And so um, this notion of environmental managerialism favors a capitalist and technocratic approach to environment, which puts that level of efficiency and productivity as the root of how we deal with the environment. So, you know, all these particular apps that are coming up that are not really taking a pro-environment stance of technologies that are really actually green, right? That are not having negative offshoots on the environment. This would be a criticism of that. Definitely desalination plants would definitely be like a part of the environmental managerialism stuff, because what happens during desalination is just like a lot of species have the possibility to get sucked up in those things and killed off. And so you have to think about how that exists and how um, those those policies that we want to think are good are only to make capitalism work more efficiently against the environment with a very sanitized face of like, oh, we're doing good for the environment. We're making a lot of like, you know, preserving these resources. But in actuality, you're only preserving those resources to utilize them more and to extract more and more, right? You're not making them plentiful in order to be plentiful for the use of common folks, but more so they're plentiful so you can extract more and more, right? And so that's what eco managerialism is really trying to get to the crux of, is like how we treat the environment and how that relationship to certain ecosystems becomes very toxic and very much so based on profit and efficiency over the actual health of the environment. So I think this is going to be a very popular K on the topic, and there's different iterations because there's so many authors that talk about environmental managerialism in certain ways. Some people will say environmental managerialism is good. And it's like, oh, okay, cool. But you know, that's the thing. Any particular questions on this environmental managerialism? It'll be a very popular K that is ran on this topic, and especially it might be an act that criticizes the resolution for its managerial approach to water resources. So that'll be a thing. So two other arguments that I think will be a thing on this topic. Social ecology. Different iterations exist of social ecology, but in a broader sense, social ecology is a philosophical theory about the relationship between ecology, social issues, and like how us as humans interact with the environment and treat it as something that is outside of ourselves. Because, you know, a lot of authors, and particularly Bookchin and even folks like Kenneth Burke, that is in like the communication studies, talk about this, like this idea of our separation from nature is what has created this mindset that we are above nature, very anthropocentric understandings, and that we should see it as an object to be used on, as opposed to us being more biocentric, right? Where we see ourselves with nature and among nature, not above it, right? And so social ecology is trying to get to another criticism of capitalism, of course, about the consumption and the production that happens under the lens of capitalism. And it says that we should engage in more communal understandings of consumption and production, ones that are not steeped in capitalist ideology. And so in this sense, what a lot of iterations of social ecology come off to be is a form of eco-anarchism. So anarchy in some ways, and a lot of the understandings of de-development, but not all social ecologists think that way, because there's more of a radical lens and more of a practical lens of social ecology. And so I feel like this will definitely be one of the Ks that exist on the topic, that it may not be as simplistic as it sounds here, but it might have more radical critiques of how we even act on the environment, and that we should probably de-develop and return back to like anar eco-anarchy based structures of like existence. But that could be a thing. I don't know if anybody's going to do it, but somebody might, because there's a lot of weird folks in debate that like type K arguments, and they will. They might even make an ad that talks about how we should develop and help water become very clear and natural again by getting rid of all of this factory and industrialized stuff that has made the environment messed up now. And then this last one here is Afro-pessimism. This will be on every single topic. With iteration, it will be up to the person that is reading it. But what I will say is that you may not see Afro-pessimism ran in the most like common ways on this topic, because I'm not as sure about the literature talking about water as a concept exclusively, but it will talk about waters dealing with like the Middle Passage and like transatlantic slavery. So people might definitely make that experience something that they talk about as a relationship to water when it comes to Black folks. But it will be a thing, but I feel like criticisms like ecofeminism, environmental justice, Ks and stuff like that would take a lot more precedence over over Afro-pessimism, but it could be a thing. I think there is also something called ecological melancholia or something that could be a thing that exists within the Afro-pessimist lens, but we'll see. So when it comes to like critical Fs, the way that this topic or the affirmative or negative constructs or represents populations maybe doesn't represent them well, or doesn't see the reality of how the inevitable failure of how we preserve or protect nature or water may not be effective, right? For example, there could be some calls to reform like environmental or water policies that have the wrong starting point. And so we start with policies instead of valuing the process and perspectives of certain people, like indigenous folks and how they relate to the land and environments and things like water, or Chicanx folks or Latinx folks or African peoples and African cosmologies, which is just like how you center the world through an African perspective, right? All these different things will exist under the topic when you are trying to criticize the topic as it exists in itself, right? And you're trying to transform these criticisms more into either political stance or like embodied criticism. So when we think about Latinx struggles or African struggles that relate to water and the way water has been situated in historical narratives, you can think about transatlantic slave trade, immigration, Rio Grande. Narrative approaches will definitely be present on this topic, and they will have all types of different iterations of how they come about to create this relationship to water and water resources and how we challenge the particular policies that come out of it. So people are going to get really creative with this concept of water. So you should be aware of that very heavily as a thing. Some teams that deal with personal identity will think about the intersections of identity that are based in race, sex, class, gender, sexuality, citizenship, and ability. All these comprise a lot of our social location and our identities. And so some people will talk about experiences of what happens in their communities when it comes to water and the environment, and how certain communities of color don't have the complexion for protection as people like Robert Bullitt, who is the father of the environmental justice movement, wrote a book about. And so we think about all these catastrophic experiences, like experiences with hurricanes, like Hurricane Katrina and all those that came after it. Like people will talk about those experiences as it relates to water, and you have to think about how you will approach that and how you will answer that. Sometimes people will make metaphors to the debate space in itself, right? Finding some metaphorical criticism or some non-literal interpretation of the topic that deals with some bad entity of labor or production or resource extraction or overfishing in the debate activity in the debate space. That will definitely be a thing, because there's a lot of people that talk about how debate extracts stuff from debaters of color and like, how we don't get that back, right? And so that could be a play on how we think about like resource extraction and debate, and how some of us have given so much time but have not gotten much back from it, and that is seen as like a over instrumentalization of our labor. Could be a thing, don't know, but that that choice is out there. Okay. Um, there's like a comprehensive list of some things that people might do in the debate itself. I'm gonna skip over this, and you'll get to have this PowerPoint. But there's just like a whole litany of stuff that people could do, right? Like different languages, sign language, utilizing of media, solidarity with particular water movements and struggles, right? Personal narration, even drag, rituals that are religiously based, right? All these things become possibilities in performance element of debate. Okay. Now, this is the important and last thing I want to discuss with y'all when it comes to constructing a performance or a critical act. The very first thing that I think that you want to think about is, what is the theory of power that you are going to use to defend arguments and see the world through? And that could be Afro-pessimism, feminism, critical race theory, animal studies, existentialism, any of those particular brands of disciplines and studies within philosophy or other disciplines. You have to be able to situate yourself within them to have a backing of your affirmative, like racial capitalism or neoliberalism. All these are things that you should try to think about as if the criticism, or is there a multiplicity of criticisms of those things that you want to include in your affirmative? Is there like some type of entanglement that exists in those things that make it so you have to criticize them all at once? I feel like on a high school level, you definitely should have some type of advocacy statement, like what do you believe should be done? What should we affirm? What should we challenge? Right? That should be something that exists. If it doesn't, it's up for you to decide how you're going to defend it. But having a clear, focused advocacy is something that's always good and that you're willing to defend. You also should have some type of role of ballot or role of the judge or a framework, right? Have very different iterations of how that exists, but it basically means that you need to have something for the judges to grasp onto of what they do to evaluate impacts, evaluate your stance, or to evaluate the performance that you're giving, because in a lot of ways people don't know how to evaluate that. You have to have some way to tell the judge what their role is or what you think the ballot should enact itself as. Is the ballot a criticism of status quo policies of water, like something along those lines that calls out like how the ballot should function? And framework in itself is like how you frame impacts in your world of your performance or critical act. And those things are kind of necessary, because without it, teams are going to read framework against you, and you got to have some type of alternative framing to help the judges understand how yours is better. And don't just read these things like tagline, roll the ballot, roll the judge, framework. You got to have really nuanced reasons why they are necessary in the debate and why they are good, as opposed to the other side. Because a lot of people just get up and read the roll of the ballot is this, and it just stays there. You need to talk about why that roll of the ballot is good. Okay. The impact, you need to have an impact, have to have an impact with these particular affirmatives, regardless, whatever systemic or systematic or structural harm that exists inside of your affirmative that you're trying to express. Anthro, sexism, heteronormativity, anti-blackness, ableism, these are all systems, but you have to talk about what do they produce that is bad, not just like reading heteronormativity or anthro as like impact itself. That is more so a internal link to a larger impact that those structural systems create. That is what you need to be creating as your impact. It's like, what is the bad thing that is produced by those systems? What does the world look like? How do people relate under that, right? And that should be a thing. And the last thing with these types of affirmatives, you might want to have preempts to properly held arguments that could be read against you. In some ways, if your criticism is not fully like thinking about nature, people will still read anthro against you. Or if you're not fully calling out the system of capitalism, people will run cap against you. And there's even framework and topicality that could be ran against you. So you got to have criticisms of those things and how to preempt their existence. Okay. So, oh, sorry, there's a question. Yeah. I'm pretty much done here. I know that was a quite a bit of information in a short period of time, but that's the shortest that I can make it in this time. If you have questions about any of these things, you can email me, and I'm pretty sure that they'll post this up. So